Hi, I'm Stephen Carson from St. Louis, Missouri, in these United States. Gonna have to figure out what to do when I wear a navy jacket. It just looks like I'm wearing black right now. But anyway, um, uh, okay, so this week is an Econ Minis, so it's going to be a number of stories instead of one deep topic. We've been doing some pretty heavy deep topics lately. In fact, I'll talk about what we did last week in just a moment, or in a little bit. Um, I do want to mention that the show has a couple aspects that are key. One is that we have a community. We use Discord as well as a sister, abridged site that you can be on even if you've been kicked off Discord. And eventually we'll get off Discord. But right now, if you go to the show link, you can find a Discord link. Please join us. We're almost at 700 members. We're like just a few members away, several members away. So please jump in there if you haven't. And if nothing else, you get an announcement of the show, but also it's a place to discuss some of the topics we discuss here and get pointers from people and so forth. Also, if you'd like to support the show, we have Subscribestar in the video description, and most of our supporters support it with $5 a month. So that is really our key support, is people giving a number of people giving very modest contributions, and your support is greatly appreciated because I'm going to have to buy a new computer to do the show. And that's going to be a big expense, and it's coming right up pretty soon. So support is greatly appreciated. All right. Let's see. What else do I need to do? Let's bring on our guest for today. All right. We have Ryan Turnipseed from Oklahoma. Hello, sir. Uh-oh. I don't think they can hear you. What's going on? Let's see. No, I can hear you, but we have no levels for you. Let me see what's going on here. Excuse us, folks. OBS Ninja. You're not muted as far as I can tell. Did you pick the right mic when you went into OBS Ninja? I wonder if Discord and OBS are fighting. Try leaving OBS Ninja and just rejoining and pick that mic again. All right. Sorry. Little technical issue here. In fact, I'm going to fix something while he's doing that. Ryan, I'll be back on you in just a moment. Let's see here. There we go. That's something I wanted to show. Okay, back to Ryan, hopefully. Oh, not yet. Okay, I'll wait for him to show back up. Hey, so call back to last week's show with Alexander Adams and John D. We talked about the art market. Since John D is working on an Andy Warhol series, he just did part 2 this morning, or this morning my time, and he's going to continue doing that. I'll be with you in a moment, Ryan. Oh. Let's see. Anyway, so my daughter Madeline was listening to the show and decided to do a little sketch of Warhol, and I thought it was fun, so thought I'd share it with y'all. Oh, and it says Andy Warhol, aka the Campbell soup guy, something like that. Tomato soup guy, yeah. Tomato soup can guy, something like that. So that's funny. Okay, now back to Ryan, and I think we still have issues, Ryan. We should have checked this before going live. Oh, there we go. Say hello.
You can hear me. All right, good afternoon.
Yeah. Right, okay.
How are you, Mr. Carson?
Okay. Right now. Okay, I'm just once the YouTube folks catch up, then hopefully they can confirm that you're hearing you. But I think so, because now I'm seeing you in the levels, and I can hear you too. So that's great. Okay, sorry folks for that. Now, where were we? I went ahead and showed them Madeline's sketch of Warhol, and let's get into the stories of the day, I think, right? Unless there's anything you want to talk about. Oh, well, I mean, I guess it's permissible to mention where you are now. Is that okay?
uh, how specific are you
No,
wanting?
no, no, not specifically. Just you're in a different phase of your life.
Yes, okay. So I just got done moving into a college apartment now. I am out of the house and in college.
Right. So this is your first show, first stream from your dorm or whatever you call it now.
Yes, it is.
Asexual
So,
facility or whatever they call it, right?
yeah.
Oh, yeah. Have you had any sermons yet about
Um,
gender equality or whatever?
Thank goodness, no. All of the stuff that I've heard so far has been from the business school, which is the thing I'm involved in, and it's all just been like very intensive how to study, how to write, things along those lines. Very actually seems useful, not indoctrination.
Okay, good. Um, okay, and they're saying your volume's a little low. I moved you up on my side, and you can just speak up or see if you can fiddle with something.
Yeah,
Um,
that sounds good.
okay, I think we're okay. Maybe I'll back myself off a little. Could you do a check, 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 just like that?
Check, check.
Okay, I think we're in a roughly the same zone at this point. Um, okay, so Chad is helping us with our AV issues. Okay, so let's go ahead and hit some stories, Ryan.
Alrighty.
And let's see here. Okay. Right. So first, I just wanted to highlight this story, which is actually a statement from the editors of the Mises Institute, or the editors of Mises.org, I guess. But what do they officially say? They say the editors of the Mises Institute. Yeah. Um, and they're actually echoing something they said over a year ago in March 2020, 16 months ago. They said there should be an end to government imposed shutdowns of businesses, schools, churches, restaurants, and events due to the COVID virus. And they quote themselves there. And then they're still saying you're quite low. So we'll do what we can.
Well, yeah.
Just speak up.
That I can do. Alright.
um,
So, um,
Okay, so anyway, and I mostly wanted to share this with everybody just because I thought it was a really excellent statement. So I'm putting the link into the live chat. I'll try to remember to put links as we go. Um, and oh, and I forgot to mention something before we went on air, Ryan. Super chats are kind of broken on YouTube. I heard this on an AA stream, and I just found it's still the case. There's usually, in my view of my channel, I can bring up all the super chats and read through them at the end. That is kind of broke. So please help me to slip in super chats as we go. If I'm not paying attention, maybe you can help me keep an eye. And when there's a super chat, we'll just try to read it before it scrolls off the live chat. The YouTube super chats. Subscribe star tips, on the other hand, are safe and sound. So that's a great way to send something in, and I'll read those first at the end. Okay, anyway, so yeah, I just wanted to share their statement on this. I thought it was really excellent. A couple points that jumped out to me was the, what do you call it when you don't have to foreclose on people? Eviction moratorium. Yeah.
yeah.
Let me just read this sentence. Read this bit. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention claims the bizarre authority, or bizarrely claims the authority is the way I'd put it, to extend a nationwide eviction moratorium, which represents a blatant regulatory taking without compensation of property owners. Actually, now that I've read the sentence, I should say they bizarrely claim the bizarre authority because that anyone would claim such an authority is bizarre, but that the CDC would claim it is even more strange. Who are they to decide about land management things or whatever? Vitiating private rental contracts is an especially disturbing precedent. and a laughable detour from the rule of law. So there's a bit in there to make left-wingers mad, because they're speaking out against messing with people who are landlords, the rights of people who are landlords. But then they also, of course, talk about the effect on everybody else of these shutdowns and so forth. So they end it with good Americans can and must resist new shutdowns, mandates, or restrictions. The 2020 shutdowns were not worth it, and we should not make the same mistakes again in 2021. Enough. So anyway, just wanted to highlight that. I thought it was an excellent statement from the folks at the Mises Institute.
I might add, this is the logical conclusion of the powers that our state has had since the beginning. With the eviction moratorium, what you're seeing is the government is effectively enumerating what you can and can't do with your own houses, really. This is just the logical conclusion of eminent domain. It already reserves the right to seize property.
That's a good point.
What more is it to just tell you what to do with your property instead of outright seizing it?
Right. Yeah, you're right. It in a way follows from eminent domain, or it's a corollary of eminent domain. If they can seize it altogether, well, then they can make you have someone stay on your land when they're not paying rent anymore. So yeah, disturbing stuff. Let's go now to a little look at inflation. The news is actually from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and we'll look at something from the Bureau of Labor Statistics in just a moment. But the headline here is, the ads. The headline is U.S. inflation, the producer price index rises to a record 7.8% in July. So let's be careful here. We're used to looking at the CPI, the consumer price index, because most of us are, we're all consumers, I would think. So that most people are in that category. And so we tend to look at the CPI. But Austrians have a particular interest in producer prices, because in the Austrian theory of the business cycle, it is producer prices where increases in the money supply tend to show up first in price inflation. So I was just admonishing on Twitter this week that a single data point without context is useless. So I'm going to try to not make that mistake right after having lectured people about it. So here is a graph to give us some perspective. And you can see the red line here. I'll highlight it. I'll highlight it. Shows us at 7.8% as of last month, as of July 2021 in the US. Producer price index. Well, is that big? Well, the red graph shows you the last 10 years. And you can see it dropped about a year ago. That low point is, I'm sorry, I'm having trouble reading it. It's, I think, April 2020. So, there was a drop in the producer price index just as the shutdowns hit and so forth. But it's been climbing. It reached previous levels by January of this year, and now it's shot way up to a record high. So, yeah, we will see. I mean, my assumption is, as we've been keeping an eye on this, my assumption is that it's the ongoing effect of the government shutting the economy down, right?
Yes, that's what it has to be, really.
Right.
Not much else has radically changed to where we can get this record inflation. That's the only major thing that's happened.
Right, and I like this comment in the chat from Sil. He says, red line goes up. Exactly. Let's see. Oh, yeah, and they do provide one other thing. Just if you're wondering where it is, I wasn't going to talk about the breakdown of where the inflation is showing up, but it says if you take out foods, energy, and trade services, you get the blue line, which has a high of 6.1%, which is also looks like a record high as far back as this chart goes. So even if you take food, energy, and trade out of it, because I know energy, it's been showing up in oil prices and stuff, the price inflation. But even if you take that out, we're still at a pretty high level of producer price inflation. And when
Yeah.
producers start getting high prices, well, it eventually affects the rest of us, right?
And it cascades. The market is dynamic. It's not just that one price that's going to go up. If it's if you have a less fuel now because it's more expensive to produce, other prices are going to go up because now transportation has increased, or transportation supply has probably decreased, presumably. It's all so
Right.
it's a bad sign for everything everywhere.
Um, okay. Yeah, our producer says your volume is sounding better now, so
Wonderful.
don't need to worry about that. Okay, now, uh, in the context of prices going up, the government is helping the situation with stimulus, uh, right? Which is, you could say, from a price inflation point of view, pouring fuel on the fire, right? They're just throwing more funny money into the whole business. But Daniel Lacalle, who I've been turning to more and more for articles for Econ Minis, because he does a lot of current event stuff and has really good analysis. He points out that the government stimulus continues to have a diminishing effect, so that he says, let's see, the United States economy recovered at a 6.5% annualized rate in the second quarter of 2021, and GDP is now above the pre-pandemic level. And he said this could be viewed as good news until we put it in the context of the largest fiscal and monetary stimulus in recent history. That is, if things were being done in a healthy way, allowing for a natural market recovery, then those kinds of figures would be like good. You kind of, it seems like from my study of economic history, it seems like the I'm sorry, I just realized I'm not showing you, and I think I could be. Let me try real quick. Sorry.
All right.
Let's see if I can get you out. There we go. Not quite right, but it's there you go. Yeah, now you're on the screen. Okay, sorry. Making changes on the fly here. Yeah, so in my study of economic history, it seems like when the economy is allowed, the market is allowed to work its magic, it does have dramatic effects over the long term, but in the short term, it's organic. You don't see these sort of wild swings. In a recovery from a government-induced crash, you see a slow but steady climb out of it. So you don't see crazy growth numbers and stuff. That's not natural in general, from what I've seen. So these numbers are not that big, but they could represent sort of a natural organic return to growth, except, as he says, for the fact that the stimulus has been just incredibly huge. We've talked about it before, but just to mention it real quick, Federal Reserve purchasing $40 billion of mortgage-backed securities. You might remember, if you've paid any attention to economic news, in recent years, the 2008 crash, mortgage-backed securities came up a lot in trying to understand what had happened. So here we go again. So they purchased $40 billion of mortgage-backed securities, $80 billion. Oh, I'm sorry. They're purchasing $40 billion of mortgage-backed securities each month and $80 billion in treasuries each month. The deficit is expected to run above $2 trillion. And so his conclusion, the diminishing effect of the stimulus is not just staggering, but the increasingly short impact of these programs is alarming. So, I don't know if I want to go through this in detail because, like I said, we've been covering this, but I do want to share the article for you to take a look at. Let me see if there's anything else I want to highlight from here. Well, that's interesting. He's saying it isn't just him here. Wall Street expected a GDP growth of 8.5%. They were sure the real GDP would comfortably beat consensus estimates. It came in massively below. So with all the stimulus, people are thinking, hey, we're going to see this roaring recovery. And it's a recovery, but it's not roaring. And he says, well, what's the problem? Uh, well, obviously, I mean, for people who watch this channel, I think you know the punchline, right? Which is that stimulus is a form of redistribution, for one thing. Um, it also is not. It's not even proper it's not even straightforward redistribution because it's done with uh, you know injecting expanding the money supply, so it gets distributed in, you might say, a rather random way, not in a market driven way, but in a centrally planned way. And so
Yeah.
he talks about let's see, um, the government continues to announce trillion-dollar packages as if any growth at any cost were acceptable. How much is squandered? What parts are not working? And more importantly, which ones generate negative returns on the economy are issues that are never discussed. So they just throw money out there in a sort of a rain from heaven, helicopter money. I'm sorry, that's our traditional way of talking about it in economics, in a helicopter money fashion, and they don't even really look at sort of the results, whether they're good, they're bad. They just do another round of helicopter money, and so you
Yeah.
just get chaos. Go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah, you get money in places where it should not be, or another thing that's not so often talked about is that you prop up things that should be going under with stimuli that normally, if something's too inefficient, aren't making a profit or anything like that, shuts down, other things take its place, other things then build off of that. That's how you get into things like innovation or better management practices, things along those lines. But if you keep the old shells of businesses that should have gone under yesterday alive by like $1 trillion stimulus packages, you're not only are you misallocating money, keeping these things afloat when they should not be, you're also halting things like innovation or different businesses that could be taking the place in a better way.
Right.
It's it's just a bad policy across the board, except for playing the political game. Like that's the only upside it is, and even then, it's not that great of an upside.
Right.
And earlier, I thought you were going to go for the other punchline, which would be GDP as a measurement is just a lot of government spending and not as much
Right.
uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
market forces. So
Right.
um, in reality, if Wall Street wanted its giant GDP surge, which is it was expecting, um, the Federal Reserve or the government's going to see that. They're going to start advocating just throwing more money at things. That's the sort of feedback loop that we're in right now.
Yeah. Academic Agent. I don't know if I think he was researching some numbers, possibly to do a video on it, but he was looking at small and medium and large businesses, expecting, based on what we'd been seeing over the last year, that there'd be a real reduction in, say, small business. We know
Yeah,
that large businesses have been doing well, but it seems like small businesses have been really hit by the lockdowns. He found to his surprise that I mean, I know some businesses that have shut down, but the numbers seem to have not really changed that much. So I guess some shut down and others started or whatever. And
yeah,
and the net effect is there's really not that big of a difference. Well, that's a little bit surprising given everything that's happened, right? But it might be that stimulus and various other government measures explain this. The economy, like Ryan was explaining, isn't being allowed to adjust to the new reality. It's things are being propped up so that everything is sort of in a stasis, right? Um,
yeah. And
in terms of
if I had to,
businesses being allowed to fail and other businesses being able to take their place. Go ahead, Ryan.
yeah, and if I had to guess about the small businesses, just from what I have witnessed personally,
Mm,
um, you have a lot of small businesses in the Midwest, generally owned by older people, people that would be more affected by everything that's happened in the past year. Some of them dying or being hospitalized, unable to manage their business more as you would normally. So you have that being passed down usually to younger people or to someone buying things along those lines. Generally, when you're on the ground, what you see then is it kind of puts new life into it. So that's just like a reason for why small businesses might not be going under in droves. There's
hmm
perhaps more effort being put into it. Another thing would be Regardless of if it's good or not, I would probably guess that forcing people to lock down would force people to learn how to do things more digitally or from home. And I would be very surprised if a lot of people didn't figure out, hey, I can run this from home, make some money off of it. I'm a small business now.
Oh, uh-huh.
Um,
I follow you.
Not a natural direction because it came by the force of the government, which means that there was probably a more efficient or a better suited way to do all of this. But I would guess that there's probably a lot of from my home businesses like just offering their services now. It might be a good mask over businesses that went under, which you and I have probably also seen a lot of that.
Right. Okay, so wrapping it up with this article, what was it I wanted to highlight? He says the entire stimulus plan is doing nothing to improve the job recovery or the real economic improvement. The real economy collapsed due to the lockdowns and is recovering thanks to the vaccination and reopening. Almost all of those trillions of dollars spent on questionable programs are generating no real effect. We can even say that jobless claims should be half of what they are today in a normal recovery, and that massive government intervention is slowing the improvement. So I just thought it was worth highlighting, right? Because if you're new to the world of economics, it just may seem counterintuitive, right? That, hey, the government's handing out lots of money. That should like help, right? It feels a little counterintuitive, I think, to the person new to economics that government showering money from the helicopters can actually slow things down, and that's because the real economy is an intricate system guided by the price system, and when the government is just raining money down, it's preventing that price system from doing its proper function, which is aligning what people, what companies do, what producers do, with what consumers really want. And it just continues with the stimulus, the increase of the money supply. It just continues to keep these things out of alignment. And the more and more they get out of alignment, eventually you have a real crash because you can't actually sustain that for long, long periods of time.
Right, and as we might know from articles like the Economic Calculation and the Socialist Commonwealth, those prices are very integral to supply systems. It's how you allocate resources, and it's why
Right.
command economies fail. You get the exact same effect if you distort the prices because now things are getting misallocated, but you at least have the price kind of masked onto the system, so it's a lot more in the shadows. It's a lot more undercover. But
Right.
being as you've still disrupted these prices, thrown money into these places where it would not have been, prices are going to adjust. You're going to be misallocating resources from where they would not have gone originally.
Right.
It's and
No, that's a really good point. Um, most people are not going to look at what's going on and say this isn't capitalism anymore, but or the free market anymore, right? The market anymore. But to a great degree, it isn't. Even though we don't have, the sickle and hammer over the White House or whatever, right?
right,
We don't have this overt declaration of devotion to a socialist economic system. Um, it doesn't matter. What matters is the on the ground reality. And the on the ground reality, as you say, is that the price system is not being allowed to do its job through many interventions and particularly dramatic ones over this past year.
yes.
So we're dealing with a broken system. Okay. You cannot print and spend your way to prosperity, he says. Okay. Speaking of spending, hey, look at that segue that I accidentally did there.
Nice.
Which one do we want to do first? There's the budget
Let's
resolution
do
agreement.
the 1.8 trillion infrastructure bill.
Is
Being as that was
that
chronologically first.
this one?
It should, yeah, it should be from the Senate Democrats, if I remember correctly.
Okay, yeah. Okay, wait a second. Oh yeah, you can't see. Okay, yeah, Senate. Okay, right.
Yeah,
So,
sorry.
setting forth the congressional budget. Yes. Okay. Trying to get to the numbers. Oh, this
So,
is really big. Oh, I don't know where to go in all this. Oh, wow. Oh, look at that.
Do you want me to
Sorry,
summarize?
I just got to the
I don't
levels
know
and
where you are on the.
amounts where you see
Yep.
the fiscal year 2022 3.4 trillion. There's a lot of digits in there, so you got to, thousands, millions, billions, trillion.
Oh, okay. This is the other spending bill. We can do that. Um,
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I do the wrong one?
well, it's fine. The both
Okay.
either work.
Yep.
So if you're in the United States, your House and Senate are both controlled by the Democratic Party at the moment. They have
With
majorities
with
in
a
both houses.
with
Yeah,
a,
we'll
a,
get
a
there.
thin majority. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, razor thin majority. They're both controlled by the Democratic Party. So is your White House. Um,
Right.
the White House and the Senate work closely together to form a budget, and you probably know the personalities that are in there. Senator Sanders has been working quite a lot on just pumping up numbers into the stratosphere.
Wow.
The Senate Democrats are perfectly content to go through with a almost $4 trillion spending bill, and some of the items in there are universal preschool, climate change initiatives, and various other increased fundings for government entities that already exist. Um, and if you just look at the bill, if you would put the link into the chat,
Oh,
Radlin.
okay.
If you will look at the bill, you can see the Democrats that are sponsoring it. It makes sense why this is coming out. It is still nonetheless insane. They are planning out the next decade of fiscal spending. Um, it's it is a you can call it a bubble like none that you've ever seen. We're into the just complete trillions of dollars, and they're expecting government revenue to increase, which necessitates tax increases, things along those lines. Because with the measures that they are implementing with this spending bill, you're not going to get more money for the same amount of taxes. It's going to be very constrictive on earnings, on productivity, things that will create value for people or value itself. It's going to be very constrictive. There are going to be very massive tax hikes. They have this very nice thing in there that looks really good for the TVs where they say, we're not going to raise any taxes on people earning under 400,000 a year. Um, but if you just know your basic political history, anytime they tell you they will not raise taxes, they will raise taxes. Read my
Right.
lips and all of that. So,
Right.
that's the overview of your Senate bill. There are 90 something pages in here. It passed just barely. Now, we mentioned earlier, the Democrats are holding on by razor thin majorities, just a couple of votes in both houses. That means it is a very good time to be a Democratic Party splinter group, just with how parliamentary politics work. So, they have say they have just they pass things by 2 votes in the Senate. Well, if I get my political friends together, and there's 3 of us, we can sink this bill if the Democratic Party doesn't just go through with our demands. Um, this could be good if you are a moderate Democrat that supports the West Virginian senator. They can force budgetary allowances to be dramatically decreased, otherwise, his vote will not go through. Or, on the flip side, it's a double edged sword. If I am a radical socialist in the Democratic Party, I can, and there's a lot more of them in there, you can abstain your, say, 6 or 7 votes and force these spendings to go up even higher. So the way the budget works, the Senate has made this, and it gets to go. It is sent to the House now. In United States politics, the House has a lot more radical members from various different backgrounds. That's just how it works. There's more room for that. There are a lot of very progressive and socialistic people in the House. It would not surprise me if this gets sent back to the Senate demanding more spending and wider measures. It is a very possible thing, and they would be dumb not to use that leverage at this point.
Right. Because no matter how much from a small government or libertarian or economic point of view, we see these numbers as crazy. There are
Yep.
people who look at them and say, you know, there's still billionaires that we haven't eaten yet, and so forth, right? But there's people who well, there are people for whom complete redistribution is their
Yeah, and
goal, and
state-owned
so anything
industries and yeah.
anything less than that is not satisfactory to them, and so they're pushing um, from the side, and as we know, they get their voice in.
Yep.
The left wing radicals don't quite get treated the way right wing radicals would, for example.
Yes, and ironically, this is one of the few times we're having more Democratic representatives and senators. We're still going to the moon with spending either way,
Hmm.
but if there were more less insane ones, which is a relative term,
Right.
then there would be less of an opportunity for these socialistic types to have their way.
I see
They
what you mean.
have the perfect field right now. It could not be better for them because they have thin majorities. The White House is senile, so they'll go along with whatever they get sent to them from Congress, and they're very fiery, and the news haven't done anything against them. They've been supporting them the entire time. Now's the time, if I am a farmer labor representative or out and out socialist, now's the time for me to throw my weight around, which is probably what you'll see, not guaranteed, but it would be very likely right now.
Right. So I think what you're saying in effect is, practically speaking, the 3.4 trillion we're looking at for 2022 is a floor. It might go up from there. It's not going to go down based on the
It
political forces in play right now.
There are, I think, two what we would consider like center. They're considered right wing in the Democratic Party.
Hmm.
Two senators uh, didn't help on this though. They still went along with it, and I don't know how many in the House because I can't keep track of 300 something representatives. There is a very small quote conservative Democratic force, but they don't seem to be acting in the same way. They seem to want to compromise, and as we know, if you have two statists compromising with each other, what you will get is just slightly more spending progressively instead of the radical policy. They haven't even done that though. There is no reason to suspect they will. So yes, it is this is very likely a floor.
Okay. Did you want to highlight anything else from this document? It's pretty big, so I
Um,
don't know how to find
yeah,
things in it easily.
yeah, and I doubt most of the people voting it even read the dang thing. So, by all means, if any of you in chat want to go through reading this will put you ahead of your own policymakers and let you know what you're in for.
Right. We do need to fit in super chats, as I said, as we go because of the brokenness on YouTube side. So here's one from Jedi Knight Anakin Cringewalker. At least in New York City, the small business loans had a number of employees requirement. My boss hired people to get the loans.
Yeah, and
Follow?
that's part of the distortions that we're talking about, kind of.
Right. And then he says artificial growth, maybe check
Yep.
debt. So yeah, so he's saying that um, you take on debt because he said they're loans, right? They're not just sheer giveaways, but there's small business loans that they're giving away, but you've got to just throw bodies in there to do
Yep.
it. So what does
And
that mean? That means you're going to come out of it with more debt. And debt that is not being serviced in a productive way because you wouldn't have you wouldn't have needed you wouldn't have needed the loan or whatever if you just could productively use those employees, right?
yes,
You throw
exactly.
them in there for the loan, so you're loading on debt with people that you don't have a way to make a good economic use of necessarily.
Yeah, you're loading on debt and you're just decreasing potential to actually turn a profit. It's a great
Right, right.
system. Like, I'm sure this can't go wrong.
Yeah, right, right. You're adding cost and debt.
Yep.
Adding extra employees that you didn't need means you're adding cost. You're also adding debt. Uh, it keeps the ball rolling, maybe, right? Because you got that little injection of loan. Keeps the
Yeah.
ball rolling for a while, but it's another one of these how many plates can you keep spinning in the air kind of thing in the economy,
Yep.
right?
And you're not going. There's no incentives aligned right now from the higher ups, the federal government to stop this. And I don't say
Yeah.
this as like some rude point. Most of them are quite old. they have no incentive right now. Most of them have no incentive to actually keep this going for people coming after them. Uh, just
Right.
the types of people that they are, the age that they're at. They're fine with this whole house of cards collapsing because they won't be here for it,
Right.
in theory.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You there's this what I think of as mostly a fantasy, but maybe was more true at one point. The statesman, right, who thinks not only of lining his pockets right this moment, but thinks about his children, his grandchildren, the effects on future generations. What is the legacy that's being left for his nation, right? All that sort of stuff. If there were any such people in the past, they're all gone now, I think. Um,
Yep.
we don't have anybody like that in politics. It's line my pockets now, pretty much.
Or at least no one that can meaningfully do anything.
Yeah, yeah. The people in charge, right? The
Yeah,
leadership
exactly.
and so forth. Okay, did you want to hit the other document?
It ties into another thing we had running on the channel, and that is the American system. It's an infrastructure bill.
Aha. Okay.
It's
Okay.
it's
What
a
should I highlight?
nice moderate $1.8 trillion. They're being very conservative here compared to their other actions, which is another political tactic. Throw a gigantic, outrageous bill. People are going to be outraged by it. It's going to be shot down, and then also uh, alongside that, either before or after, because bills aren't passed instantaneously and implemented, it's a process. Pass something that is more than you would have done originally, and it will go through because now it seems, by comparison, much more moderate. So, this is $1.8 trillion for infrastructure. It's your basic stuff, and also with the tagline to build back better. So, uh,
Right.
it's
I'm highlighting right now, Ryan, the line that says the fiscal year 2022 budget resolution and instruction that allows for 1.8 trillion in investments for
yep.
working families, the elderly, and the environment. And you're saying what that really means is infrastructure.
Yep, and that's how it's marketed as well in the debates was an infrastructure bill because they are
Right.
pumping tons of money into housing, rural development, technology and infrastructure investments, environmental things, all things that have to deal with infrastructure. They are pumping still an insane amount of money, not as insane as they just did, but still an insane amount of money. And this will, and I'm not hyperbolic, this will have consequences everywhere, because this is covering the entire nation, and it's not just some isolated nation. This will spill out to the world. This is covering the entire nation, and now it's hitting specifically the rural populations, the land, the housing, and farming through the environmental regulations and spending that they're having. This is not going to be good.
Um, I am going to just jump because I have been interested in this. Yeah. Oh, it's right at the beginning. Um, let's see. Yeah, I'll just read this first sentence. On July 13th, 2021, the Senate Budget Committee, with the support of Leader Schumer and President Biden, announced a framework agreement of $3.5 trillion in fiscal year 2022 budget reconciliation instructions to enact the Build Back Better agenda. And we've highlighted it a little bit in the past, but that's a phrase that I associate with the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab. And we see it not just in American politics, but we see it behind Boris Johnson sometimes in the UK. Behind Biden, we've seen Biden speaking in front of the Build Back Better thing right behind him. It's everywhere.
Yeah.
The Pope, yeah,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, his inclusive capitalism scheme is founded on Build Back Better. So,
right,
very internationally influential figures. And now it's coming to your rural doorstep now if this bill is to be believed. So
yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I think you said that. Highlight that for me one more time. The rural aspect. You're saying that
so
they're going to try to not just be in the cities. They're going to try to do infrastructure all over the place.
they are, so if you will go to their Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs, it's receiving $332 billion. And one of the points on there is, quote, creation and preservation of affordable housing by making historical investments in programs like the Housing Trust Fund, Home, the Capital Magnet Fund, and Rural Housing. Now, if you notice that last part, rural housing, that's not an agency, that's not an acronym, it's not a
Hmm.
division. That is just rural housing. That, like, as you would think of generally. That is a lot of resources from a very hostile state coming right to the doors in some form or another. I think we can both guess what this is probably going to entail. Right to the doors of the rural population. Um, if you're looking at this from like a power and politics perspective, the
Hmm.
current regime right now does not have the rural backing or its support or its submission. This is a very great way to leverage power, either soft or direct, depending on what this gets used for. It could be appropriation and redevelopment via eminent domain, or it could be, the typical Keynesian throw money at it, hope it develops, here's a graph to support it, and just screwing up rural communities by destroying the price system and the market in there. So uh, that's that's what you're looking at, and then there's a whole list of other things. Universal pre-K for 3 and 4 year olds under the Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions.
Okay.
Tuition-free community college, so they're pushing through the free college under an infrastructure bill. Pandemic preparedness. Um, Probably shouldn't elaborate much on that because we're on YouTube. You can probably guess, just looking at the news, what this money is going to be pushing for. Um, Workforce development and job training, marketed very practically. Sounds really good to get people to learn new skills and go out into the market and work. In reality, what this is your Alinsky community organizing. It's going to have a
Right.
heaping heaping pile of indoctrination to go along with it. So you can you can read into all of this, and you are going to be correct if you do, because in politics from anywhere, what is written down is not actually what's going to happen. So it this is what's happening. The Committee on Finance as well is also going to be strengthening IRS tax enforcement. It is a whole it's a nightmare for any of us that actually value things like liberty, self-sustainability, Jeffersonian ideals of just owning a farm. Um,
Right.
they're coming for you now with extreme amounts of money that they just printed.
Yeah. Um, Here, let's having to do these super chats as we go. Don't want to miss them. So here's
Yeah, sounds
from
good.
I am gonna butcher this Norse name here. Petter Christian Vikstad. Who
Okay.
knows? Okay. Do people foresee the cost of maintaining sewers and water pipes in general? My pipes are 120 years old, by the way. What about yours? Yeah, now you'd think that with all this talk of infrastructure, that if we get anything out of it, I saw someone else in the chat. Let's see, Eric Rees says, "May I assume that despite all the infrastructure spending, the USA's roads will remain about as poorly maintained as ever?"
Yep.
Right. So you'd think that with all this infrastructure spending, and I have to admit, even I was naive enough to, for a microsecond, think this. I thought, oh, they're gonna like really fix, roads and bridges and
The
water,
potholes will go away, and
sewers and
yeah,
water pipes, and sort of like not the sexy stuff, right? Like uh, the um, the stuff that really needs to be done, but you don't necessarily see it until it breaks, right?
yeah,
But it's really important just to not sink into being a third world country or whatever, right?
uh huh,
But I'm guessing from your whirlwind tour of this that it's more like our classic internal improvements American system.
that
We're
is
gonna
exactly what
we're
this
gonna
is.
buy
Yes.
votes with it. We're gonna grease the palms of friends. We're gonna do stuff that's visible and sexy, right?
Yep.
We're going to
So
invest in minority communities, all this showy stuff that isn't necessarily what you think of when you think of infrastructure as an engineering type, right? Where you're thinking, the basic, the stuff you don't see that supports everything else. That's what I think when I think infrastructure.
right, and just to like really quickly tap into history here, the American system isn't some historical phenomenon that happened centuries ago. It
Right.
still exists. This is the modern iteration. I'm not applying I'm not being
Right.
anachronistic here or anything.
Right.
This is literally the American system being recommended to the Senate and the House by people that will use the phrase American system. And this is the type of bills that you get now that it's taken to its almost its logical conclusion. We're almost there.
Right. So staying on that uh, historical rabbit hole for just a moment. On this show, we talked to Tom DiLorenzo about the real origin of the war between the states, and so we talked about Lincoln, or Hamilton, Clay, Lincoln, and then Ryan and I did Reconstruction after the war between the states, and the point of all multiple points, right? But one of the points of all of that is that the economic system of the United States was changed at that time. Lincoln's vision, even with his assassination, was put into effect. And certain parts of the country, certain industries got benefited at the expense of everybody else, right?
Exactly.
And then, spoiler, that never got dislodged. Like, think through your what you know of American history since the 1860s and 1870s and the installation of the American system and all that. What is the point where you think that got removed and we went back to another point? Now, give me a sec. Some people that are sort of like maybe sort of low IQ leftists or something would say, well, Reagan, or in the UK, Thatcher, the Reagan Thatcher years, they tore all that out and they put us back to a dog eat dog market system. That is not what happened. Okay.
Yes, and I have something that might even surprise you.
Okay.
Most historians on the matter consider the end of the American system to be the 1970s with Jimmy Carter. And that's because, like most historians on the topic, they look at rhetoric and not what actually happened, what was implemented. Jimmy Carter's rhetoric, if any of you recall, was very deregulation, but also very welfare. It was a synthesis of the two: robust welfare network and heavy deregulation of industry, so that you could potentially pay for it. Most historians will then say, "Oh, well, here's the end of the American system." Because you have a president, the White House saying we need to deregulate and allow these things to take off. In reality, that's not what happened.
And the Civil Aeronautic Board was ended. So there you go.
Yeah, yeah. And
the whole system was over.
What they will point to. Yeah.
Right.
So, don't let that fool you. It is very dumb, and you can see that with what Carter's administration did and what happened during it. You had the stagflation years, gas rationing.
Right.
You had all of these other terrible things that were quite honestly very artificial and just coming back to bite these people. Historians will look at that and say that's the end of the American system. It's gone. It's a historical phenomenon now. Even though they still use it to define modern phenomenon, this is the mainstream narrative, and that's how many holes that you can see are in it.
Wow.
So.
All right. Okay. So, anything else you want to highlight here?
Nope. I think that people can go read for themselves for anything more, or you can assume what's in there, and you will probably be correct. It's every Democratic talking point, every government expenditure. It's in there.
Right. Yeah. It's you can play bingo, or whatever, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Racial equity, check. Go through the whole thing, right? Okay. So. Now we're going to shift towards what the thumbnail and show title promised, and we're going to start turning from domestic affairs to foreign policy. Let's start with more of a, here, let me see if I can make this a little bigger, a little more readable. See how that looks. Oh, now it's off the screen. Here, let me try that. Okay, again. Okay, there we go. Yeah. Okay, so this is a piece by Murray Rothbard. Many people may not even know about this, but there was something called the Old Right, and it was kind of funny because it was, you might think that this was like, reactionaries from the past who, you know, were just old and finally died. And, you know, actually, it's a little more complicated than that. It had a lot of what we see these days, with disaffected leftists, basically, who start rebelling against the direction that things are going. So some of the more important members of the old right were people who had thought of themselves as, you know, sort of left liberals in good standing or whatever, social democrats in good standing. And then they got really concerned about the direction things were going under FDR and so forth. But anyway, Rothbard was young at the time, but he considered himself a sort of junior member of the old right back then, in the early days of it. And then he was one of the, as they started disappearing, being censored, being driven out of Buckley's new right. People don't remember, but it was called, well, be careful there. Neoconservatives were quite a bit later, but originally it was called the New Right, and that was in contrast to the old right. And Rothbard himself was more of an old rightist, and he himself was purged by Buckley along with many others. In particular, they would get purged over foreign policy, because the New Right, and it really reached its apotheosis. I'm not saying that right. Apotheosis with the neoconservatives later. The New Right was pro-war, and the old right wasn't. Go ahead.
I would like to clarify on what I said. The neoconservative movement usually gets a lot of prominence with the 1980s or so.
Right.
But their intellectual leaders, their foundation, the liberal war hawks of the 1950s and 60s, they are effectively the same thing, and a lot of them were in the same movements. They aren't necessarily so separate, and those liberal war hawks ended up being disillusioned with more Trotskyite or Stalinist elements in the left-wing field, and defecting over to what are considered right-wing forces,
and taking them over.
Buckley himself, I don't think was a Trotskyist in his youth.
No, he was
However,
not.
a lot of people he surrounded himself with, and a lot of people that joined this movement were, and that's what you get called the neoconservatives. People like Gene Kirkpatrick, people along those lines. They weren't just active in the 1980s and then went away. Their foundations, their intellectual basis, are in when you get they do exist when you get the New Right to come to fruition.
Right. So anyway, real quick, let's look at Murray Rothbard's The Old Right on War and Peace. He says that as the force of the New Deal reached its heights, remember that similar to what we're seeing now, the New Deal was just an astonishing growth in the imposition of the federal government on everyday life. It was sort of stunning.
Gold. Yeah.
Yeah. What'd they do with gold? Say again.
They literally seized it. FDR had an order where he seized gold from households.
He literally seized everyone's gold.
Standards.
Yeah, I mean, just imagine, right? So this shocked people who maybe had been being the boiled frogs, right? Suddenly they hopped out of the water. So he says, as the force of the New Deal reached its heights, both foreign and domestic during World War II, a beleaguered and tiny libertarian opposition began to emerge and to formulate its total critique of prevailing trends in America. I'm going to skip all the smearing by the left. The Beardian, Charles Beard, important historian, the Beardian ideal of abstention from European wars was essentially not a chauvinist scorn of the stranger, but a call for America to hearken to its ancient aim of serving the world as a beacon light of peace and liberty, rather than as a master of a house of correction to set everyone in the world aright by force of bayonet. If the isolationists were not themselves libertarian, they were at least moving in that direction, and their ideas needed only refinement and systematization to arrive at that goal. It's very important to always remember that in the modern age, I mean, you can go back and be anachronistic and talk about Alexander the Great or whatever, but in modern times, the imperial state tends to be in the French Revolutionary model, the French Revolution
Yep.
armed, right, where they have taken over in France, and then they start going to spread enlightenment everywhere else by bopping you on the head until you submit to their enlightenment, right?
Right.
And that is the model that we saw under George W. Bush. A global democratic crusade. I'm forgetting the terms they used, but
Well, hold on. We
yeah,
can even bridge the gap here between that large time frame. You see this with communist leaders like Leon Trotsky wanting his worldwide revolution,
right.
and you see people of the new conservative movement, like the Bush family, have something very similar, but instead of Trotskyite communism, it's democracy and
Yeah.
establishing a new world order
Oh, I know what they called
by
it.
their own
They
words.
use the phrase, Ryan, global democratic revolution.
Yep, and if that sounds exactly to me like Trotsky's world revolution.
Yeah, it's just
And
democratic instead of socialist, but as Hoppe teaches us, democratic,
it
it
is the
pretty
same.
much is socialism. So yeah, it's just words, wordplay. Um,
Yep.
okay, so let's see. Oh yeah, well let's name some names because these are great names to me. I've read a number of these folks. The intellectual leaders of this old right of World War II and the immediate aftermath were then and remain today almost unknown among the larger body of American intellectuals. Albert J. Nock, Rose Wilder Lane, whose mother wrote the Little House on the Prairie books, Isabel Patterson, Frank Chodorov, Garrett Garrett. It is, by the way, to a friend who handed me The Discovery of Freedom by Rose Wilder Lane that I credit my discovery of libertarian thought, and I've been at it for 30 years since he handed me that book, continuing to learn. So he says it takes a great effort of the will to recall the principles and objectives of the old right. So different is the current right wing today. This is something that's confusing, I think, to some people who first come among the find themselves among the red pilled, is that we hate conservative Inc., as it's called.
Yes.
The mainstream conservative movement is not viewed as a reactionary, truly conservative, right wing,
Yeah.
whatever you want to call it. They're not viewed as that phenomenon. They're
And you
viewed
don't even
as
have to,
they're viewed as like a trick, basically,
yeah,
right?
you,
And
you
that's
don't even
certainly
have
my
to
view.
distinguish between true or false conservative. Most of them have just started saying we are liberals and not in the classical tradition.
Right, right. Um, so, so yeah, they're just a trick to siphon money away from people of goodwill who are concerned about the things happening and make sure it doesn't go to anyone who'd make a difference. That's their job. So philosophically, the major emphasis was on the natural rights of man, arrived at by an investigation through reason of the laws of man's nature. The intellectual heroes of the old right were libertarians such as John Locke, the Levelers, Thomas Jefferson, Paine, Thoreau, Cobden, Herbert Spencer, and Frederick Bastiat, a big favorite of mine, as
Yep.
people who watch this channel know. In short, this libertarian right based itself on 18th and 19th century liberalism and began systematically to extend that doctrine even further. Got to mention this book, Albert J. Nock's Our Enemy, the State. Fabulous title. There's also Patterson's The God of the Machine. He doesn't mention it here, I don't think, but I mentioned Discovery of Freedom by Rose Wilder Lane. Oh, that's great. There's a chapter in Patterson. I forgot about this. Chapter in Patterson's The God of the Machine, Our Japanized Educational System. He says that chapter virtually launched the post-war reaction against progressive education. He mentions H.L. Mencken, who is just great fun to read.
Yeah. So
And so here's what Frank Chodorov says, leading disciple of Albert J. Nock. The state is an antisocial organization originating in conquest and concerned only with confiscating production. There are two ways of making a living, Nock explained. One is the economic means, the other the political means. The first consists of the application of human effort to raw materials so as to bring into being things that people want. The second is the confiscation of the rightful property of others. The state is that group of people who, having got hold of the machinery of compulsion, legally or otherwise, use it to better their circumstances. That is the political means. So I'm sorry, you were going to say, Ryan.
The education system is a big one, and this ties into another a larger point that I can make here. The old right, having its foundation in people like John Locke, who by all means we would consider liberal now, was able for over a century. These aren't new thinkers by any Locke and Bastiat. They aren't new thinkers by any means. For so long, these elements of the old right and any precursors were able to hold liberal economic, or what we would know as liberal economic positions, while also being able to reconcile that with like social conservation or traditionalism, or conservatism rather. With the new right, you get new sets of thinkers that mandate like a sort of Chicago style or Keynesian, depending on who you've got, economic philosophy, and a sort of apathy towards social conditions, as in just go with whatever's fine or in right now. It's not our place. With
Oh.
these old thinkers, it is possible to reconcile a traditional view of social orders and human interaction with the economic theory that we have. Hence why you can get people still coming out of this tradition, like Hans Hermann Hoppe, who quite very artistically can put together both of them into literature for you to read.
Right.
You don't even have to derive this from the thinkers themselves. It's still going. It's just not the right that is in power. We have the new right who completely abandoned these things and went to now what we would know as just liberalism, social liberalism.
Right.
So that's kind of like an important point. And with the education system, the original point, what you see is earlier on in American history, when you had more classical elements in control of the system, the education that you would receive would not be centered around one test at the end of it that would determine here's your grade, here's how well you did, we've empirically measured it. It would be much more practical. With interactions with East Asia, the Chinese and the Japanese, colonial forces brought back the idea of introducing standardized tests like the bureaucracies had in East Asia to the education system, and starting to empirically measure that, because this was the 1800s. This is where empiricism starts to become big. This is what happened to the education system. It went from very practical and you can go search for yourself what knowledge you want, to let us empirically test you and put your knowledge to a number. These are big things here. It's not just, the education system. This is what your society's founded on now, a degree of credentialism.
Okay, so continuing here, he says the old right did not sign on for the Cold War that started swiftly right after World War II, and this is the kind of thing I love to highlight, things that you might not have known. It is difficult to conceive now that the main political opposition to the Cold War was led not by the left, then being brought into the war camp by the ADA, but by the, quote, extreme right-wing Republicans of that era, by the Howard Buffetts, yes, that's Howard Buffett, father of Warren Buffett, and the Frederick C. Smiths. It was this group that opposed the Truman Doctrine, NATO, conscription, and American entry into the Korean War, with little grateful acknowledgement by left-wing peace groups then or now. So basically, you had right-wingers, the extreme right wings, the far right. They were the ones fighting all this stupid crap, but no one remembers because that doesn't fit the narrative, right? Which is that right-wingers are painted as stupid, patriotic, kill the foreigner types, belligerent. Yeah. So what do you do with people like this? And we're gonna have a great quote to give you a flavor of the real right back then. But go ahead, Rand.
So at the time, if you want to like put a historical note to this, so you can go search later after the show. This was the isolationist lobby, or at the time, just this is a comparison. You can see between the old and the new, right? These people were called America First because the idea was if we isolate ourselves, we aren't sending our own men over to die. We aren't throwing our money into what is essentially colonies and overseas territories that we're confiscating off of these old empires. We're keeping it here at home, and people can, live their lives. They were called the America First lobby, uh, and you can see how that's been appropriated today into something much different. So that's like your historical note for you to go and look later if you want to.
Sorry, just got bad news about my friend Paul Gottfried. Looks like there was an accident, and he is in the hospital. Oh boy. Okay, so I'll have to find out what's going on. All right. Thanks for sharing that in the chat, Jay Galt. Sad to hear this. Okay, so back to something Paul Gottfried would greatly approve of, talking about the old right. Yeah, so let's give you a flavor of what the right sounded like as opposed to the caricature that we get from Hollywood. This was Buffett, Howard Buffett. He was Taft's Midwestern campaign manager in 1952. And here he is on the floor of Congress and attacking the Truman Doctrine. He says, even if it were desirable, America is not strong enough to police the world by military force. If that attempt is made, the blessings of liberty will be replaced by coercion and tyranny at home. Our Christian ideals cannot be exported to other lands by dollars and guns. Persuasion and example are the methods taught by the carpenter of Nazareth, and if we believe in Christianity, we should try to advance our ideals by his methods. We cannot practice might and force abroad and retain freedom at home. We cannot talk world cooperation and practice power politics. So if that reminds me of anything in recent times, that sounds a little bit like how Ron Paul talks, right?
Yes.
That's if you've ever heard Ron Paul talk about foreign policy, that is more what the old right sounded like. Okay. All right. So then there's I'm going to skip a lengthy Frank Chodorov quote. Let's see. Yeah, he says the old right, Rothbard says the old right reached its full flower in devotion to peace during the Korean War, which provoked several efforts during the trenchant efforts during the early 50s. Yeah, he quotes from people who were writing against conscription and the Korean War. Frank Chodorov consistently worked against the war drive in analysis and later as editor of the Freeman in 1954. Faith and Freedom, I remember that, the right-wing libertarian journal Faith and Freedom featured an all-peace issue in April 1954 with Garrett, Robert Lefebvre, an industrialist, and Rothbard himself. Garrett wrote The Rise of Empire, which is in The People's Pottage. My late friend Justin Raimondo loved to quote from Garrett, from that in particular, I believe. We have crossed the boundary that lies between republic and empire, he says. Anyway, so I've shared the link in the chat, and you'll see if you enjoyed getting a flavor of what these guys sounded like, I recommend you read through the whole thing and read the lengthy quotes. He says, these quotations give the flavor of an era that is so remote as to make it seem incredible that such views should have dominated the American right wing to the current right wing, which has virtually obliterated its own former position. We can call it that exactly now, but soft on China, maybe. Hey, there's our segue.
Right.
Okay.
Very nice.
So let's go with that then and talk about China. So this has been of concern to me. Let's see if I can get this to be a little bigger on the screen without messing things up. Okay, there we go. This is from Joseph Solis Mullen from just earlier this week. China won't be taking over the world, gave us the title of the video today. And I thought it was fair game to cover this. It's not that long. and it summarizes some points that we've already been making on this show. We've covered China in the past. We've talked about the new Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative. We've talked about the debt-ridden nature of the Chinese economy. And we've talked about some historical precedents. I'll bring them in as we go. I do want to bring in some precedents, but let's go through this article and comment as we go. So he says, while the U.S. has its problems, future global Chinese supremacy won't be one of them. Far from being in a position of overwhelming strength, China and its communist leadership face imminent, multi-front domestic crises that will threaten the existence not only of the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, but the existence of the Chinese state as a unified whole. So he says he's not sure China can even hold itself together.
Right, and that's a very intelligent historical view, just looking at the history of China.
Right, and we'll get to that in a minute, next paragraph here. Further, there are several insurmountable obstacles to its seriously disturbing core U.S. interests, or expanding its influence much beyond its own coasts before this happens. Okay, so point number one. China's geography is terrible if projecting power is a state aim. Endless flatlands running into Mongolia and Siberia to the north, deserts and mountains to the west, more mountains and dense jungle to the south, while its eastern coast is ringed by states terrified of an expansionist China, Korea, Japan, and the Philippines, along with other affected regional actors such as Vietnam, Indonesia, and India, will work hard to keep China boxed in. One of the most trade-dependent countries of the existing order, China faces hazardous supply chain access in the event of any conflict in the South or East China Seas. So you see China real big on the map, and that does not tell the whole story, okay? And we're about to get into something else that we've highlighted on this channel. But one of the things he's highlighting is, you might imagine, because there's so many Chinese people, we know that, right? That they have a high population. You just imagine this huge landmass with all these people just, ready to burst out of this in every direction, right? But he's pointing out, no, that's not exactly what China's like. If you actually look like where the people are, for example, right? When he talks about these deserts and mountains and flatlands, those are sparsely populated, right, Ryan? That's my understanding. There's parts of China in the west that
Exceedingly so.
hardly anyone is there.
So the west of China is either very arid land or it is a just straight desert. The Gobi runs through there. There's also a bunch of other smaller deserts that you wouldn't recognize by name. South of them, you have the Himalayan mountains in Tibet, which is itself, though it has or rather because of its very high altitude and various other land surrounding it, it is also essentially a desert. So that whole giant blob of China off to the west, it is not that valuable at all, and China mainly holds it because they've historically held it. They had sympathizers there during the Civil War. That desert region was controlled by a warlord who was sympathetic with Stalinist aims. Stalinism isn't that far away from Maoism. They both worked closely together. You also have, however, in the same region, you have many Muslims that sided with the Republican government, and they have not really let go of their grudges. Islam, not that friendly with communism, especially when they've sided with the side that lost the Civil War. So they also had various Islamic insurrections to deal with then. Not many people there, though, so they're hard to fight. Like, they live in the desert, they know the desert, very hard to fight. They haven't been that cooperative. And then, if you continue along the border with Mongolia, still very sparsely populated, but the land gets a little bit better. Most of the population is going to be centered along the coastline and along the rivers and in Manchuria.
Right.
So it's very
concentrated. So mostly in the east along the coast. That's where the vast majority of the Chinese people are, right? So we see this big
whole country,
we see this big landmass, and what you don't see is that most of it's empty, relatively speaking. And these billion plus Chinese people are mostly in sort of a thin strip along the ocean, right?
And along rivers. Yes.
And along rivers going inland. Okay, got it.
Yes.
Okay, so let's jump to the arable land, because that is one of the things that I've learned while doing the show that really blew my mind. And this article actually puts it better than I'd heard anybody put it before. China is seriously strapped for foodstuffs. A shocking statistic. On a per capita basis, it has less arable agricultural land than Saudi Arabia. Think about that. What farmland China does have requires enormous amounts of petrochemical fertilizers and laborers to keep even moderately productive. Further, lacking interconnected east-west flowing waterways, moving mass amounts of produce around internally is expensive and inefficient. Produced foodstuffs must travel to the highly populated eastern seaboard provinces. The world's largest food importer by far, China is heavily reliant on the continued stability of global supply chains and access to markets. So that's another thing you don't see when you see that big blob on the world map, right, Ryan? Is you don't see that they are not self-sufficient. And when we say not self-sufficient, we don't mean for luxuries. We mean they're not self-sufficient for eating food.
And I might add, this is a new phenomenon, at least in the extremity that we now see it today. Jump to a little over a century ago, back to the imperial system and the early republican system before the whole thing collapsed into the Civil War. China was not as heavily urbanized. You still had major population centers, but you don't have what we have today, where the land going along the rivers, the coastline, places that are easy to transport. Most of it was farmland, which is what it probably naturally would be had we not had Maoism come later in the century, where it forced urbanization, things along those lines. The Chinese Communist Party really forced urbanization. It's where their support was. It's where they could easily control things. It really diminished the farmland. Because where are you going to build cities? Well, not out in the desert in the west, and not near Mongolia, not in the mountains to the south. You're going to build it where it's easiest, in that flat land by the rivers and the seaside, which is also where you had a lot of your farmland. So, Maoism, as usual, shot itself in the foot here.
Yeah, I didn't think about that. That they, no surprise, right, that the communists left a mess. But you're being a little more specific about the kind of mess they left. Yeah. They left one that, because of their own understanding of Marxism, I guess, they felt like industrializing had to be, rapid industrialization had to be the step forward towards communism, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Towards the ultimate communist endpoint, they had to go through this industrialization because that's one of the stages of development that Marx identified, or whatever. Yep. And so you had the Great Leap Forward and things like this, where they did just absolutely absurd things to try to industrialize, and it did very inefficient things. It caused starvation, caused famine. It was just a big mess.
And you can see this with Mao's policies towards farming. One of the more popular ones is that he had, I believe it was a sparrow. It was like a mandate to kill every sparrow that came along because they were considered a pest and decreased farming output. And the environment, like the market, has many facets that you can't just measure. It's very difficult. It is very dynamic. So what you have as a result of this sparrow being killed and taken away is the farming output decreases because now another pest comes along that the sparrow was killing. So very hard to actually plan around that stuff. Mao destroyed the farming capacity for those few years until they could get it back in, not to the same numbers it was beforehand, but at least existing, so to placate the problem. That's a popular example. He had his entire day to plan stuff like this while he was running the country after he won the Civil War. And the farming output of the communist government was very diminished compared to what it was before the Civil War. And you can see this even in American popular culture. Instead of the starving Africans that you needed to go help, it was the starving Chinese. I believe, what's the Christmas movie with the Red Ryder BB gun?
A Christmas Story. A Christmas Story.
Yes, that's it. There's a line in there, you need to eat all of your food because there are starving Chinese people that could eat it.
Yeah, right.
So this is the kind of stuff you're going through, and it was so pervasive that it even got into the popular culture.
All right, so what's next? In terms of internal stability, China's sheer vastness creates ethnic and regional problems as well. Ryan's started to refer to some of them. Large populations of Uyghurs, they've been in the news or in the propaganda lately. Uyghurs and Tibetans inconveniently located in strategic areas far from Beijing, as well as a variety of much smaller ethnic groups in the mountainous jungles to the south, the CCP faces multiple permanent secessionist dangers far from its core.
Yeah, and it
Go
might be
ahead.
good to note most of the, or not most of them, a lot of these are not ethnic. There's also great religious divides in China as well
Right.
that will breed its own secessionist movements as well. And on top of that, of the ethnic and the religious, you have regional secessionalism that's not even necessarily ethnic, but they had a higher degree of autonomy for the rest of Chinese history, except for under the Communist Party. Uh, like those mountainous provinces in the south, very hard to administrate from Beijing or Nanking. So they had just naturally a higher degree of autonomy. Um, they were warlords in the Civil War. They were its own. It was its own province in the imperial system. But now that we're under communist China, it is very centrally administered. People don't like that. Go figure. When
Mm-hmm.
you autonomy is a very desirable thing, not just in terms of efficiency or anything along those lines, but just it's something that people like. And when you take that away and start imposing direct orders from Beijing, it is very unpopular. And so this isn't even ethnic or religious, though it can be for smaller groups of people in there. This is just, we don't like this. We've had our autonomy forever, and now it's being taken away. So,
Um, right. And the only other thing I'll highlight here is he makes an interesting point, which is that the East, the richer Eastern provinces are, yeah, such as Jiangsu and Zhejiang. Um, they want to have more to do with wealthier Japan and Korea and the rest of the outside world than with the hinterlands of China's western barons. And so we see moves by the Communist Party, the central government, against the Shanghai centered tech sector and the billionaire class to try to it's a nod to these distant regions and saying, hey, we're thinking about you. And right, so there's like class warfare going on and the government's trying to play both sides, I guess. Right.
right, and as usual, this warfare only exists because the government originally got involved. But with these wealthier centers along the coastline, historically they were very autonomous because they were very rich. They could protect themselves, didn't need to be centrally administered, and they would usually swear fealty to the emperor who had the mandate of heaven. And it was this way until Mao took over, and then they had wealth confiscated or they joined the Communist Party, and instead of swearing fealty, they had fealty imposed onto them and it started to be centrally administered. And as an example, you can see this when China was getting carved up in the Opium Wars or things like that. The British, for once, didn't just draw a random line in the sand and say, this is ours now. They wanted these autonomous, very autonomous provinces that already existed. So, like, you can see this in Chinese history. It's nothing new.
Hmm.
It's a very Chinese phenomenon.
Hmm. Okay, next there's the demographics. Um, Again, this cuts against this story that China's just ready to take over everything. They've actually got a huge problem demographically. He says from a combination more or less forced mass urbanization, Ryan was talking about that, state-induced famine, and then two-child, then one-child policies. The China faces demographic collapse. It is going to run out of taxpayers, laborers, consumers, and then the one-child policy imposed under, interestingly, not Mao. It was actually under Deng Xiaoping that we get the one-child policy. So in the 1980s, this led to selective sex abortion.
Yes.
Okay, so it is right about the time China's economy collapses in on itself, it is going to have tens of millions of young men unable to find a job or a girlfriend. By 2030, China will have 4 retirees for every 2 workers and child. Ouch, he
Right.
says. So, what do you have, historically speaking, Ryan, when there's a bunch of dissatisfied young men because they can't get jobs or women? What is that a recipe for?
Not only do you have a revolt, you have a particularly bloody and radical
Mm-hmm.
revolt because you can sometimes get revolts over like tax policies in the medieval era or
Mm-hmm.
farming famines, things like that. But if you have young men who have very few other people in their life who are now out of a job and have to, and in the lowest part of their lives, they aren't going to be doing much else but being genuinely more radicalized to like actually not the propaganda term for radicalism.
Mm-hmm.
You're not necessarily going to get something good out of this. You might think, well, they might oppose the Communist Party of China, therefore they're good. Well, not necessarily. There are a lot of radical things that will answer this problem for you that do not necessarily have to align with us at all.
Right.
um, and this is very dangerous for everyone involved, and this is how you get the Communist Party of China in the first place. uh, this is how it came about originally. So this is very dangerous even for us out here, because who knows what comes next out of this, if this is how history will play out. If we get this giant multi-million man revolt, very brutal, very radical, nothing left to lose, what comes next? It's a dangerous position.
Yes. And in particular, it seems to me, I mean, I'm watching from a distance. I have visited China a couple times, but I'm mostly watching from a distance. And it seems to me that keeping the country together and maintaining internal stability is the obsession of the ruling powers in China right now. Everything they do is about that. That's what I'm feeling from watching their moves. Um, People are seeing them as thinking about U.S. elections and stuff, right, or whatever.
Right.
I maybe I don't know, but I really don't think that's top of mind. Top of mind for them is not having this thing blow up in their faces.
Right.
That's really
Yeah.
what I'm saying, right? And
Yeah.
it's
They've got many bigger problems.
some of these tensions we're talking about, internal tensions, right? It's not so
Yeah.
much external pressure, really. It's really internal, structural issues that I think are really the big thing to watch about with China. I don't think Japan's about to invade them. I mean, maybe the U.S. hostility, as he mentions at the end of the article, U.S. hostility is a problem, though probably it just gives some support to the central government, because you can
Right.
always play off the foreign enemy and say, hey, I'm here to protect you against the big bad guy over there, right? That's what they try to use China and Russia with for us Americans, right? Well, same thing, same dynamic happens in China. Look, the United States is being aggressive in the South China Sea or something, and we're the ones who are standing tall for China, right? So they can use it to sort of,
Exactly.
but I don't think, realistically, I don't think the U.S. is going to be invading China anytime soon, or anyone else.
Yes,
China
it'll be
falling apart
much.
though because of its own internal problems, that I could see happening.
And if anything else, if there is foreign intervention, it will be very soft. The Chinese Navy is not known for its competency. They rely on a lot of sea imports in docks that have been shoddily made very quickly and largely by the Chinese government, like their ghost cities and things like that that are already
Mm-hmm.
falling apart after a few years. And they
Right.
don't even have a navy to protect these sea lines that well. Uh, it's a very tenuous situation. If the Chinese Navy actually has to go and do something, it is a very strong likelihood that they will fail at that.
Mm.
It is a very, so as we mentioned earlier, China imports a lot of its food. Those are not land routes. It is very difficult to get overland into China through the borders it has. If you've ever read about Marco Polo's adventure, thing like
Mm-hmm.
that, it's hard to go through the Gobi Desert, the Himalayas, the wastes of Siberia. You
Right.
go in, you go in through the sea. Um, and if you don't control the sea, you are at the mercy of everyone else who might not like you for the things that you've done. Uh, in fact, early on, you can see this early on. The Straits crisis, the Republican government, with the help of the U.S. Navy, was actually able to shut down a lot of China's sea lanes, and
Mm.
uh, Kai-shek tried to launch a reinvasion of the mainland, kind of like a round two we've built up. Didn't work because, land army's important on the mainland.
Hmm.
But that sea power was very strongly, very constricted. It was a very tenuous situation, and that hasn't really changed very much.
Right. Okay, so let's move now to the economics of the situation. We've laid out some of the demographics, the lack of farmland, many other sort of geographic and population issues. Now let's look at the economic situation. And he says that how has this whole show been kept going? It's because of their position as a mass global exporter. And so they have been able to keep those, they have been slowing down. We've highlighted previously in the show. They were growing at just crazy figures, like historically unprecedented for a while after Deng Xiaoping. Growth, annual GDP growth rates that were just mind blowing. Other governments, other countries would have loved to see those kinds of growth rates, 9% a year and 10% a year, just nuts kind of growth.
Right.
That is in the past. It's been in the past. But they have staved off even more of a slowdown with state credit, industry subsidies, and dumping, and that's allowed them to keep everybody employed because, as we mentioned just now, you got a lot of the young men who you need to keep in a job, or they could become a political liability, right? A political risk. So
Yes.
they are trying to keep everybody working, even if in proper Keynesian fashion, it's just about the moral equivalent of digging a hole and filling it back up again, right? I mean,
Yeah, with spoons. Yeah.
yeah, with spoons, yeah, right, exactly. So they're keeping everybody working, everybody's happy, we're all happy, we're not going to revolt, right? But they've been doing it with a lot of debt, a lot of infrastructure projects that make no sense. So what does he says? However, decreasing returns on additional debt and continued overproduction, combined with domestic underconsumption and low-cost labor competition in its region, mean the bill is about to come due and it's going to be enormous. Total debt is now 3 times the output of the Chinese economy annually. And the expansion of debt and credit has accelerated in recent years. So they're having to pump more and more in the system to keep it going. It's not sustainable. I mean, they can't keep doing this. It's not like they've got a steady state situation. They don't. They have an unstable situation, which they're having to pour more debt, more fake money into to print, increase the money supply and so forth to keep it going. Until the past year, the Chinese financial system was creating 5 times the money supply of the Federal Reserve System each month. So we think we've got it bad. The Chinese government is going nuts to try to keep this circus going, right? Let's see. Because of centrally directed malinvestment, these non-performing loans total an estimated $7 trillion. For some perspective, the subprime crisis that crippled Western financial markets was saddled with less than $1 trillion of such bad loans. Okay, so we had a big crisis with less than $1 trillion of bad loans. They're thinking China has $7 trillion of bad loans.
Don't worry,
Right.
we'll get there soon.
They're not going to, yeah, right. Much of the debt is short term, meaning it is frequently rolled over with new debt. And so they're getting ever decreasing returns. This is just, I hope we're painting the picture here. This picture that's given by the war hawks of China as this unstoppable, economic powerhouse. Well, I've heard this story before. Let's finish up the article, and I want to draw some historical analogies. Okay, so Belt and Road Initiative, we've talked about that. It's only making things worse. This is a worldwide, like Keynesian infrastructure project, you could say, or a collection of projects. Spawning ever more yuan, more Chinese money, which they loan and then spend on projects of questionable economic value around the world and equally dubious means of repayment. But CCP policies privilege employment and state stability over efficiency and productivity. Just like I was saying, they're worried about keeping this whole show going, not about sort of building a solid, firm, solid economic structure. The Belt and Road Initiative isn't working, nor will China 2025. That's some other program they've got. Xi Jinping has already shown repeatedly that the economy can't be seriously reformed. Most of its high technology was bought or stolen, and as recent evidence has shown, the CCP absolutely cannot tolerate a vibrant and freewheeling Shanghai tech sector. So that is, they prop up an artificial economy, and when a real economy, real market activity starts to happen, they start coming down on it because it introduces instability, political instability in the country. So it's just, I would not want to be in the shoes of the CCP trying to keep this thing going, right? Okay,
Chinese
so
politics and the history of the world, Chinese politics has always been a very tenuous balancing act on a tightrope. It's if you favor this group over this other group too much, you're going to have a revolt on your hands. If you neglect this infrastructure over here, people are going to starve and you're going to lose your power base. If you don't, everything is just a struggle to keep power in China, and that's why you have so many different fragmented eras where you have between 3 and 50 different people or organizations claiming to be the true government. It's just how China works, geographically and religiously and politically. It is not meant to be some unified central state. You can with the way the imperial system worked, you can kind of keep a hold on it if you have enough decentralization. Let different provinces organize themselves as you have with a federal monarchy system.
You're saying like a devolution strategy could keep stability rather than trying to keep so much power in the center. But that's not really the approach they're doing.
Right, and that's most Chinese empires or dynasties start like that and slowly centralize, and then you see them collapse because centralizing it provides an unwinnable game.
Okay, let me jump in with this because he's saying just what you're saying. For all of the CCP's propaganda, fragmentation rather than unity has defined Chinese history. It's just what you've been saying. Spanning approximately 2 millennia, for only 300 of those years were the borders of more or less today's China, united under a Han-dominated central political authority. So, those of us who don't know much Chinese history, and that includes myself, are just picturing that China was just always had something like its borders under the control of the Han. And he's saying, well, for about 300 years in there, out of 2000, it had something like that. But other times, it was more decentralized, right?
Right.
Left to itself, locked in the South and East China Seas, it would likely face the threat of serious collapse and fragmentation by the late 2030s, he says. And then he goes on to say that he thinks that anti-China action from the U.S. is probably contributing, as I said, to holding this whole fragile mess together a little bit. But don't count on it. Did I share the article? Go ahead. Your comments?
If I may add 2 things here, so just to even show how little unity China had just before all of this, before you get the Republican Revolution of the 1910s and before you get the communist takeover of the 1950s, the last imperial dynasty, quote, holding China together with its modern borders, it wasn't even a Han dynasty, it was a Manchurian dynasty, and they were seen as outsiders, and it forced them to have a decentralized system. Which is how they managed to keep power for so long. People will point to them and say they had a really strong bureaucracy and a political system, but in reality, most of the governors were calling the shots for most of the people in these provinces, and they delegated power further. You haven't had a centralized Chinese system even similar to the one that we've had in Chinese history. It's completely new, and like most things you see in history, when you try something completely new, it's not going to last too terribly long because you do these old things that we've done for so long for a reason, usually. The other thing, to tie this into the old right and the foreign policy, the old right usually had a very sensible idea about how economics worked, and that had to do with some of their philosophical foundations. Uh, some of them were Austrians, some of them weren't Austrians, but they usually were closer than we are today. They could see that most of these dragons that, or most of these, yeah, most of these dragons being painted on the foreign policy scene were more paper than they were real because they had theory to fall back on. Most of the Warhawks will be very empirical. They will show you data and graphs and form their conclusions off of there instead of starting at theory. Us Austrians know that if you just look at China's GDP, that it's meaningless. The GDP isn't how you measure the power of China. The Warhawks will measure China's GDP or their trade output by like a quantity or something like that, factor that in, and say they're really strong. Austrians, we know that a lot of that is state spending, forcible state allocation. It's inefficient. It's distorted. You oftentimes just have no supply at all, hence starvation. It's not a good system. That on top of our historical analysis, which usually uh, don't let that have any bad connotations. Like looking at history, the two mesh together very well, Austrian theory and history. You can see that this is not some terrible evil empire coming to take over your home tomorrow. It's not going to last. They're having too much trouble at home. They're having too much trouble on the seas and with other countries. It's not the big the great evil that the Senate or the House of Representatives or the White House is making it out to be. Uh,
Um,
this is where the old right got it correct once again.
yeah. So let's read this one from Jedi Knight Anakin Cringewalker. Couldn't the CCP bulk export people to colonize? Confucian Rhodesia could be a thing in a generation, though that's another generation's problem. I'll share my thoughts first, Ryan, then maybe you can share it.
Yeah,
So
sounds good.
my first thought is that we've got this demographic issue, right? So I think that would make more sense when you think about like Africa, where they've got a lot of young people.
Yep.
And so you've got young people migrating in large numbers into Europe, for example, from sub-Saharan Africa. You look at their what's that thing that Mad Merc taught me about, the population thing where you'll see the shape of it.
Population pyramids.
Population
Yeah.
pyramid. Thank you.
Yes.
You look at the population pyramid for some of these South African or sub-Saharan African countries that are sending so many young men to Africa, and you see this big bulge in the young ages and less old people relatively, right? Well, we just
Correct.
described what China's population pyramid looks like. It's got a big bulge up in the older, and they don't have very many younger. So they don't have enough younger people in China to keep like the civilization rolling for the elderly that are rapidly becoming a bulk of the population. So who are they going to ship out? Are they going to ship the elderly Chinese off to colonize somewhere? I don't think that's going to work out very well.
Right.
If they ship off their young men, which they have a surplus of, so it sounds almost like a plan, right? Well, if they ship them off, well, who's going to keep the lights on back at home? I mean, somebody's got to, be a garbage man. It's, just keep the whole, do the practical things that you have to do to keep your towns working and so forth, right? So yeah, that is my concern about the CCP. That is my thinking of why such a plan. I don't see it working out. I think the CCP would consider it for a moment and go, yeah, that's a bad idea. But thoughts?
Yeah, so just to touch on the demography for a second, population pyramids, you can go look it up. They're very intuitive. Like, there's no need to really explain it here. A healthy population pyramid is a slightly larger base and then kind of straightens out towards the top. Not too radically. You don't want a triangle, but you don't want a surplus at the top either. China's is a very reversed. It's a very it's an upside down triangle, if you will. It's very bad demographically, and you can go into the many reasons why that's not for here. In regards to a Chinese colony, that has happened before. They have had, like, I believe it was ethnically Han communities on some of the Indonesian islands that were Chinese colonies. Usually got taken over because they couldn't sustain themselves. They were very isolated from their neighbors, and it was oftentimes more profitable not to be there. They were formed out of opportunity. I mean, it's happened before in history when China had better demographics, but even then, sending out these people for colonies. China is not friendly with foreign governments. If you are going to colonize places, on top of all their other aggressive things, it's not going to end well. You have to get supplies there. China has a great problem with supplies, as we've discussed ad nauseum. Sorry, that might be insulting, but I think we've hammered home the point. China cannot manage supplies well. They don't have a price system. It's government allocation, etc. A colony by the Chinese government would require even more intensive supplies being put towards there, and for what gain? You're not solving any problems by doing this. If you have a Chinese colony elsewhere, now you've just taken your radical young men and put them farther away from your eyes, and you're sending them resources. What are they going to do?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I'm
Or if you're
thinking
sending
about
the elderly,
about
it's
Lenin being put on the train back into Russia, right?
exactly
It's yeah,
yes.
send your people off to the modern equivalent of Zurich to go stew in radical political ideas and then come back and cause trouble at home, right? I'm actually going to have to wrap it up, Brian, because it's time to
Sounds
bring
good.
some children to karate. But I think we covered what we wanted to cover today.
Yes,
I had
I
one
think
more
that's
article. I'll just stick it in there. It's called China, the regime's managed economy is stagnating. So if you're interested in a little bit more on the economic picture in China, then I've included that. Thanks, Ryan, for joining us in your first. Is this your first week of classes, or
My first week is next week.
next week? Okay,
I
yeah.
have until Monday.
Okay, well, thanks for joining us with this. In fact, we could warn people the showtime, just to peek ahead a little. Showtime will be a little bit later to accommodate Ryan's class schedule. And then we already know what our topic is next week. I want to continue what I'm going to call the Road to Empire series. We talked about Hamilton Clay Lincoln in an episode. We talked about Southern Reconstruction. The next part of the story is the War on the Plains Indians. I was thinking to skip it because I didn't know much about it, but it turns out Ryan does. So I think we're going to be able to cover it. You're from Oklahoma.
Live in Oklahoma and not learn this stuff.
Right. So we're going to be able to cover that very important chapter. And I think quite soon, within a couple episodes, you're going to understand how those 3 episodes combine with the next one that I'm not going to mention yet, that'll come after that. And it'll be clear that what all of this leads up to and how it brings us to what we're now dealing with on a global scale, the U.S. empire. So we are going to tell a very interesting story, and fair to say, Ryan, a tragic story.
Oh yeah, well yes.
Like Reconstruction, another tragic tale. So not a happy story, unfortunately. Okay, well, thanks everybody. Please support us on Subscribestar. I hope you like the depth that we do on this show and the unique combination of economics, history, and politics. And we look forward to talking to you next week. Bye.